Good afternoon, everyone. This is Chris Riley with System Source. Thanks so much for showing up on, I guess, the day after the snow apocalypse here in Maryland, anyway. So I know that so many folks are working remote since they can't get to their offices still. So we appreciate your showing up. I know some of you couldn't get a pizza today because they weren't delivering or you weren't where the pizza was going to be delivered. But again, we appreciate your time today. So we have lots of good stuff here for you. I'm joined today by Alex Wilson, who's a senior wireless consultant, and we're going to be digging in really in a couple different areas. One's looking at obviously how do you build that secure, high-performing Wi-Fi. We'll also look at how do you kind of improve what you have. So it's not just a matter of hey, throw out everything that you've got. Let's all add new. So we'll dig into things like what's the current state of Wi-Fi out there? There's lots of standards, and usually lots of questions about that. We'll dig into that. We'll do some tips about how you make your Wi-Fi perform, particularly your existing one. We'll talk about special environments, large settings, schools, office spaces, high rises, things that may be kind of have some special needs attached to it, and how you can address your Wi-Fi in those areas. We'll talk about some things that you can do now to try to make your current environment work better. And then we'll also talk about how do you kind of plan if you're looking towards an upgrade, how do you kind of design for that for the future. So that's what's coming up. A little bit of housekeeping here. So first of all, if you do have a pizza coming to you today, give them a few extra minutes. If it's not already to you, they may be navigating snowy streets and sidewalks and driveways. So give them a few extra minutes. Just note Julie Dellinger's email address on the screen. If it still doesn't show up and you're expecting one, just go ahead and reach out to Julie and she'll try to help you out on that. During the webinar today, the audio is in presentation mode, which means that you'll be able to hear myself and Alex, but we won't be able to hear you, sadly. But we do that so that any noise, background noise, music on hold, those types of things that may be where a participant is doesn't come through to the whole group. But you can reach me at any point right through the chat tab and go to webinar, as well as through the questions tab. So any questions, go ahead and just submit them at any point that they pop into your mind. Go ahead and put them through the questions tab. I'll save up all the questions to the end. We'll have a Q&A after the presentation itself, and then I'll read those questions out to Alex, and then he can address those at that point. The presentation as well as the webinar will be provided to you, so we'll send you a link to the recording of the webinar as well as this presentation after the session, so you don't have to write furiously. There's also an evaluation at the end. We take those seriously, so just taking literally takes about a minute. You'll get that after today's session. So sending us that feedback is both appreciated, and we try to make it a little bit more fun by pulling from the completed evaluations for an Amazon $50 gift card, the gift that always seems to fit. All right, so just a little bit for those who are a little bit newer to System Source. So in brief, so System Source, we've been around since 1981, and we work in a number of different areas for IT professionals, kind of from Pennsylvania all the way down through the Baltimore and the Washington, D.C. metro areas. So a lot of folks first come to us when they need to acquire new technology, things like wireless or switches or other types of things that you need to make that network go. But we also are doing really that whole modern data center, whether that is going to be an on-prem traditional, or it's going to be in its various cloud variants like in Azure or in AWS. So regardless of where those computing resources go, we work in helping to do design, implementation, security, troubleshooting, really across the modern data center, which for most folks, they have resources in all of those places, including colo centers and on-prem. So regardless of where your data lives, we can help design solutions for that. Folks who really are acquiring to improve. So we talked a little bit about cloud and our consulting services and really designing things for server and storage and security and firewalls and switching and obviously wireless today, virtualization solutions. We have lots of folks that are coming off of VMware and going over to things like Hyper-V or up to Azure. So with the changes at Broadcom and VMware. So we do a lot of consulting in that area. A lot of places other people try to improve is in training, with over 600 or 700 classes at any one point on our schedule across about 3 dozen different areas and manufacturer training areas, all on our website there. And then presentation or present is our presentation systems group, so professional AV. So all those Teams rooms and WebEx rooms and Zoom rooms, so all the displays and projectors and monitors and speaker systems and microphone systems for huddle spaces, presentation areas, conference rooms, all the type of work that our friends in presentation systems do. And finally, we maintain all this stuff either on a you call us when things go bump under service and support, whether you have a client or a contractor with us or not. You can always get a 7x24 just to our main number, just follow the voice prompts after our hours, as well as through managed services where we are the IT department for dozens of organizations in this region. So that's a little bit about System Source today. We have a whole bunch of upcoming webinars. I'll just touch on them briefly, literally 2 pages of that. And that's just what we have through next month. So this Thursday, we're gonna have one that's on Azure. So I won't go through all the titles here. So that one's gonna be on Azure next Thursday rather. We'll be looking at VMware alternatives. VMware, Broadcom has changed VMware substantially, raised the prices incredibly, and people are looking for alternatives. We'll delve into that then. Then one on ChatGPT on February the 10th. That was actually had to be rescheduled from last week since the presenter was ill last week. So that's same session as well as going to be last week, but it'll be on the 10th. One on Power BI on the 11th. And then rounding out the month with a whole one on email security, an important one for how do you kind of stop those email attacks. Then we'll be looking at what we can learn from the Verizon report on security on the 18th, and then finally wrapping up next month on the 19th with another Azure one, but one that's going to be how do you kind of control the costs of Azure. So we'll be looking at some of the tools and ways of doing that on the 19th. So that's a little bit about what's coming up. Lots of stuff there. When you get this presentation, those are all clickable links, and they're all on our website as well, of course. With that, let me go ahead and hand the reins over to Alex, please.
Oh, good afternoon, everyone. Today, I'd like to talk to you a little bit about some of the key factors that will help you make sure you have a good wireless network. We're going to take this all the way from design to operations. Quick background on myself. I've been around the tech world since the early DOS days, so I'm kind of old as dirt in that respect. Kind of was around when networking was really taking off and wireless was taking off. We do a little bit of everything in the wireless spectrum, both in building and outdoor Wi-Fi. We also do a lot of point-to-point, point-to-multipoint design for your long-haul microwave links, as well as connecting a campus, for example. We've built out wireless internet services, and we've also had some fun scaling some towers and climbing various towers and such. So we've got a good background on the wireless. And so I'd like to talk to you a little bit today. We'll start off with the current state of Wi-Fi. You know, the good subtitle for this, not so much welcome to 2026, but more like welcome to the state of confusion, because there has been quite a bit of confusion over the last couple of years with the wireless standards. So taking a look at where we are today, and we're not going to hit this really hard, but we're going to kind of breeze through some of this stuff just to level set everything. Today, Wi-Fi 7 is the current standard. It was introduced in 2024. It had been in development for quite some time. However, that doesn't mean that's the only standard. And you know, Wi-Fi 6 is still considered relevant and current, and that was introduced in 2021. Wi-Fi 5 is still considered relevant and current as well, and that was introduced in 2013. And Wi-Fi 4, while sort of not as relevant and current as it used to be, it is still in use heavily and was introduced in 2009. So if you think about it, we're working with some pretty old technology here. While all this is going on, you're probably getting pounded in the back of your head from other commentators and other sources, especially a lot of your consumer brands that are pushing Wi-Fi 8 already. And Wi-Fi 8 doesn't even exist yet today. And so keep that in mind. It's not even due out until the mid to late 2028 range. So it's not relevant. There aren't any devices on the market, although some companies are swearing they're going to have things out in 26. But at the end of the day, these are not commercial brands. These are consumer brands, because consumer brands are driven by the churn that they can get out of you to try to, build up their revenue streams. Whereas commercial vendors are more concerned about building up more of a longevity, a history, and a reliable network. Consumers just want to, consumer brands just want to get you to buy something every year. Now, what's interesting about Wi-Fi 8 is that the focus is really going to be on high reliability rather than speed. Now, nothing's going to change with the current performance that you're getting out of Wi-Fi 7, but they're going to focus more on ultra high reliability. There will not be any new frequencies introduced. And basically what I try to tell everybody is, for now, just ignore the hype. Focus on what you have today and what's good out there. So a couple of things I want to clarify. A lot of folks are still confused about Wi-Fi 6. A lot of them think that this means you have 6 gigahertz, which is not totally correct. Wi-Fi 6 did not include support for the 6 gig radios. That came in Wi-Fi 6E, which was an extension of the Wi-Fi 6 standard. All it really did was just add support for 6 gigahertz. It is very important to read the specifications on any device that you plan on purchasing to make sure you understand what it supports. They're not always very clear on it, and sometimes the marketing write-ups or the ads can be a little bit on the confusing side. Now, something else to keep in mind is that not all Wi-Fi 7 devices support 6 gigahertz. A lot of people have the assumption that it is required to support it, and that's actually not the case. The only requirement for what frequencies are supported is that at least 2 frequency bands have to be supported. So it can still be 2.4 and 5, it could be 2.4 and 6, it could be 5 and 6. It really doesn't matter, because what they're doing is they need to support what's called MLO, or multi-link operation. And this is a functionality of Wi-Fi 7 devices where it can use 2 bands at the same time, or even 3 bands at the same time, to provide better connections. Now, for that to work, the client devices have to support it as well. And so a lot of your current client devices that are in use that are a little bit older are not going to support MLO. So it's important to check with your vendors on that. Keep in mind that while MLO is there, if not all your devices are supporting it, you're not going to get the benefit of it. So it's not necessarily a selling point, in my opinion, but it is a useful thing to have available. Also, keep in mind, some of the Wi-Fi 7 devices still only do 2.4 and 5, especially with the outdoor devices. So be very careful to read the specifications. Now, a little bit about 6 gigahertz support. The 6 gig spectrum is shared with licensed users. These are mostly in the cellular telecom industry, and they're used for long backhaul lengths. We're talking links that could be, 5 miles, 10 miles, 20 miles, even, as much as 40 to 50 miles. As a result, any 6 gig outdoor device must use what's called the AFC, or the Automatic Frequency Coordination system, which is basically, it's a database that's published. It keeps track of all the licenses and where they are located, what azimuth they follow for each of their connections, and so forth. And so your access points that are being used outdoors that support 6 gig have to check against this AFC to make sure that they can use that particular frequency. If that frequency is in use by a licensed holder in your area, then they might get pushed to a different frequency. So it's very similar in concept to DFS, except it's not cutting you off completely. It's just pushing you to a different channel. This does require that the AP actually has a GPS in it, as well as a gyroscope. So this adds size to the APs, it adds cost to the APs, and as a result, these are typically going to be restricted more for outdoor use. As a result of this, you cannot have outdoor APs with omni antennas on them, because an omni is broadcasting in all directions, which could potentially create interference in any direction at that point. Also with that, an indoor AP cannot be placed in an outdoor space. And by FCC regulation, an outdoor space is considered anything that is not fully enclosed. So for example, putting it underneath a porch or under a deck, even though you put it in a box, like a plastic box, that is not considered proper outdoor usage or a proper outdoor AP at that point. And so putting an indoor AP in that situation would be a violation of FCC regulations. Indoor APs use a low power indoor mode. They have access to all the channels, but they're limited to a 30 dBm broadcasting power. An outdoor AP with the AFC connection can use standard power inside as well if it can make the AFC connection. Problem with that is most of the time your ceilings or roofs are going to block GPS access. The nice thing though is if you can do this, you can get up to 36 dBm of power out of them. So to kind of summarize where this stands, Wi-Fi 7 is the current top standard, and that's what you should be designing for today if you're doing a new design. If you're currently in a Wi-Fi 6 environment, that is a viable option to stick with for several more years so that you could plan out your Wi-Fi 7 or Wi-Fi 8 down the road upgrades. Keep in mind too, if you have Wi-Fi 5 today, it's still viable, but it should be something you're starting to think about replacing with Wi-Fi 7 as your time and budget allows. And also keep in mind that a one-to-one replacement of the older APs for newer will likely result in poor coverage or a failure altogether. The reason for this is that when you start to move, and we've actually encountered some recently where they were based on a 2.4 gig design, and we were upgrading APs that were almost 15 years old. You cannot take a 2.4 AP and replace it with a Wi-Fi 6 AP and expect it to perform in the same manner. The coverage will not be the same. And so what ends up happening is you end up with smaller coverage areas, which can lead to gaps in your coverage. So how do we get peak Wi-Fi performance? Kind of like an athlete, you need to tune your network like you fine tune your body. And I'm a big fan of the rotisserie grill. I actually have one. I've had it for many, many years. But unlike the rotisserie grill, Wi-Fi is not set it and forget it. It's kind of like a pet. It needs constant care and feeding. And if you don't take care of it, it will end up squeaky like mine does. It's quite annoying to listen to. But you don't want your Wi-Fi network to be annoying and squeaky, so to speak. So we need to tune it properly. So let's start off and we'll talk a little bit about channel management. So the first thing we want to do is we want to try to avoid channel reuse and overlap. Auto channel is an option that many people use, whether it's Cisco or Meraki or Aruba, Ubiquiti, Fortinet, doesn't really matter what brand. They all have their own form of auto channel, but it is not always the right way to work it. What we have found over the years is that when you're in an environment that is extremely noisy, lots of other things. So you think about, high-rise apartments, high-rise office buildings, dense business parks, schools. When you're in an area with a lot of access points or a lot of neighboring systems, auto channel has a habit of just kind of curling up in the corner and starting to cry. It just cannot perform and keep up with the constant changing environment. So some things to keep in mind with channel management. You want to keep your channel widths to an absolute minimum. Basically, it's kind of like medicine. You want to apply the minimum effective dose because anything beyond that is going to start to be wasteful. When you increase your channel width, yes, you get more throughput, but also at the same time, you are increasing your chance of interference and you're decreasing your gain. So by keeping the channel width to a minimum, you by default increase your gain and you decrease your interference issues. Keep in mind that when you go for a wider channel, it's bonding multiple channels together. And so it's going to create a situation where you might be on channel 36 at 20 megahertz and your neighbor is on channel 44. Sounds like you're on the same or on different channels. But if they're running at 80 megahertz, they're bonding 36, 40, 44, and 48 together, thus stepping on you as well. Also, with a wider channel on 5 gigahertz, it will decrease your gain by 3 dB for each increment. 3 dB may not sound like much in the way of a power increase, but if you understand the logarithmic scale, that's a 50% increase in power by just gaining 3 dB of gain. That could be huge in a situation where you're trying to reach further. So learn to read the channel charts to guide you. I've got those coming up here in a few slides. They'll be part of the slide deck, and you can have access to them that way, or you can download them right from the source, which I'll talk about. So specifically for 2.4, we only, in the United States, we only use channels 1, 6, and 11. And you'll see this in the chart in a moment. There's overlap if we use any other channels. The key is to avoid two APs side by side with the same channel, which can be quite challenging when you only have 3 channels to use. We never use 40 megahertz unless you like to destroy spectrum. Keep in mind that one of the most common sources of interference are going to be your wireless printers. So all of those printers that are out there, they may not even be in wireless mode. You may have them plugged in, but by default, most of them are broadcasting a wireless SSID. And one of the things we often look for is that, and we look to turn those off, because the manufacturers of the printers really honestly do not understand Wi-Fi, and they love to use a 40 megahertz wide channel, and they seem to love channel 6. The problem with that, at 40 meg with channel 6, you are interfering with channels 1, 6, and 11. And so it can create a situation that makes your 2.4 almost unusable. Other things to keep in mind, the 2.4 spectrum is oversaturated. It is used heavily by IoT devices, Bluetooth, Zigbee, and BLE devices. So if you take a look at the chart, and it's a little hard to read, it's a little confusing. All of my charts come from the Wireless LAN Professionals website. These are the peers that I work with on a daily basis, and they've created some really nice charts, and they keep them up to date as things change. So at the top half, it shows the 2.4 spectrum, and you can see where the green line, which the second line up from the bottom of it, showing channels 1, 6, and 11, those are the channels we want to use. And you can see how channels 2 and 3 and 4 overlap with channels 1 and 6, which is why we try to avoid those. A common problem you run into oftentimes is you get what we call the unkind neighbor, who puts everything on channel 9 or channel 4 or whatever channel they pick, because they don't understand how that actually works. In some cases, some of your devices out there on the market will just automatically choose non-standard channels. But if you also notice, Zigbee, BLE, and Bluetooth all broadcast in the 2.4 spectrum. And so if you're in an environment, we've actually run into this in a warehouse once where they were doing order picking, and they had Bluetooth enabled devices in the order picking area. And they had so many of them that 2.4 was not usable for Wi-Fi other than for the Bluetooth. So some other things, moving on to 5 gig, we want to always use the minimum channel width needed. When we think of a warehouse, we typically are going with 20 megahertz because we have high numbers of access points that can physically see each other. So if you think about an open warehouse, all these APs up at the ceiling, while you might not be able to see them from the ground, if you get up to that height, you'll notice that you can see all the way across the warehouse. Well, those APs see each other as well, potentially, and that creates interference and channel reuse issues. We typically will go with 40 megahertz when we have high numbers of APs, but we have a real high throughput need, such as in a school. And there we try to use power and obstruction to manage the coverage of each AP. 80 megahertz is usually reserved for environments that only have 3 to 4 APs and no neighbors, or in a contained area, like for example, inside of a conference room that is in a concrete building, for example, or in a concrete room. A lot of houses that are built, like say in Florida, or offices built in Florida, for example, are built out of solid concrete. And in cases like that, you can probably get away with it because you're not going to see the other APs outside of it. Be very careful when you're mixing your channel widths that you do not inadvertently overlap them, and make sure you're using all available channels to prevent reuse. It is okay to use DFS channels and non-DFS channels together, but you have to be mindful of how you use them. And so a little bit about the 5 gig spectrum, you can see on this chart, the areas in green are your non-DFS channels. These are pretty much, use them at your convenience and you're not going to have any issues with them. These are going to be the highest powered channels you can use. It would be channels 36 through 48 and 149 through 165. The blue channels are considered DFS. These are shared with other sources such as marine radar, spaceborne sensors to communicate back to ground, weather radar, which are the ones in yellow, so 120, 124, 128. Those can be hit quite frequently by other sources. So if a weather radar unit powers up and broadcasts into your direction, your AP has to vacate those channels if it's on one of those three channels at that point. This can create an issue if you're set up to fixed channel settings. You know, that AP may go offline. Normally, depending on the vendor, most of them will just pick another channel randomly, which is great. You get the AP back up, but now your AP is on a channel that may be in conflict with something else. Some of your auto channel systems will also refuse to use DFS channels. And that is a bit of a problem because, as you can see, with only 4 channels on the left and 5 channels on the right side of the non-DFS, that gives you up to 9 channels. But if you start to go to 40 megahertz, now you're down to 4. And if you go to 80 megahertz, you're down to 2. So you could run into the same problem that you have with 2.4 and not have enough channels, which is why you need to spread things out. I do not recommend using 160 meg channels. It's available, it's an option. Not all clients support it. But in order to do that, you have to use DFS, and you run the risk of high levels of interference at this point. The FCC regs are listed there in the second row. It shows what the power limits are under FCC. And then additionally, you can see others that are on their charts because this is an international chart. It shows, you know, what the options are in other countries. So if you are an international organization and you're dealing with wireless management both here and abroad, make sure you understand that it's not the same in all countries. And, you know, I do designs for the US, I do designs in Canada, I do designs in Europe and Africa and other nations. And I'm constantly referring to these charts and to the internet to find out what options I have. And in some countries, it is absolutely criminal to use anything other than that. So, you know, you have to make sure you're also purchasing your access points according to the country you're going to be installing them in. So a little bit about 6 gig channel management. Now this one gets a little bit challenging because there's a lot more spectrum available here, and there really is no reason to use the super wide 160 or 320 megahertz channels. Just because you can does not mean you should. When you go to those super wide channels, you are increasing your chance of interference. Even with 6 gig, even though it's not used as much, you are definitely raising the chances for interference. Also, you're raising the chance for device compatibility issues. And so oftentimes the device just can't support that wide channel, and it'll either force it to go lower or it may just vacate the 6 gig band altogether. It just depends on what the vendor did. If you're in an Apple heavy environment, then you should also consider matching your channel widths between 5 and 6 gig. It will help with roaming. And we'll talk about Apple devices a little bit later. Also keep in mind, the higher the channel frequency, the more affected it will be by obstructions. This is because the 6 gig range is starting to get, it's more of a more logarithmic than it is a linear in this case, but you're starting to see more and more as you go up in higher frequencies, you're going to find obstructions, rain, you know, weather, things like that will affect your higher frequencies faster than the lower frequencies. So here's the chart. They do break it down by both low power and standard power, and so you can see you've got a lot of channels available. Make sure you understand which ones you're using. Keep in mind, standard power is going to be typically reserved for outdoor APs, and the low power indoor will apply to pretty much all APs that you have that support 6 gig. But do keep in mind, not all APs are created equal, and some vendors are still a little bit behind on upgrading some of the newer rules, especially when it comes to other countries. And keep that in mind as well. Again, if you're international, 6 gigahertz is not supported in all countries at the same levels. Power management is also incredibly important. Power affects the size of the coverage cell. And so when you apply the power, you want to apply it to each radio at different levels in order to cover the areas effectively. The goal of good power management really is to ensure that your coverage cells are as close to equal, or with the preferred bands being slightly larger than lower priority bands. And so what I mean by this is you want your 6 gigahertz to cover a little bit more than your 5, and you want your 5 to cover a little bit more than your 2.4. That's going to mean you're going to have to raise the power of the higher frequency in order to get it to cover the same amount of space. When you do this properly, it's a form of natural band steering. And so the devices will prefer the higher frequency, which is going to be your better data throughput. But it's not always your best connection. So it's something you got to balance. Some vendors do support very precise power settings. Some only allow ranges, and then they vary it automatically within the range. You'll have to look at each of your, each brand as you work with it, or work with, your consultant to figure out, which one does which. Lower power settings will typically do better than higher overall. So you want to aim for a design that is based on a mid-range power of the APs. It is entirely possible to have an AP that can scream so loud that it reaches really far, but then you have devices that are really terrible and can't reach back. So they can hear the AP, but they can't communicate with it. And so you want to find that balance. And if you think about it, your worst devices are going to be the ones you put on your hip or in your pocket, your mobile devices. They have really bad antennas typically, and we cover them with a case, we stick them in our pocket or a purse or in our bags, and then we expect them to perform the same way as a laptop, which has much bigger antennas and better positioning. So again, a lot of it has to do with what your devices are as well. So we want to target that mid-range power for our design. Now, we don't want to design at full power, because then what happens if you have a change? You have nowhere to go but down. And so with a mid-range power, you can increase the power or decrease it to fine-tune your environment. Placement matters. We use obstacles such as pillars or cubicle walls or walls themselves or glass features or artwork, TVs, pretty much anything you can imagine can be used as an obstacle to help manage the cell coverage and the cell size. Be mindful of the construction. Make sure you understand what you're dealing with. Straight up drywall is not going to be that destructive to Wi-Fi signal. But inside the wall, it's not just studs and insulation, but somebody put sound barriers in there, or there's sheets of metal, like for example, in a hospital, the common wall between 2 rooms is often full of gas lines, liquid lines, electric, sheets of metal to help hold everything together and give mounting locations for heavier objects. So those walls can be very destructive, whereas the common wall that doesn't have the bed up against it might just be cheap drywall. And so, your signal may transmit better. Or think about a school, where the hall walls are made of the concrete and they have lockers on one side or the other, but then the walls between the rooms are just cheap drywall. And so you can have some real differences in how the signal propagates. Also think about where you're placing your APs. For example, putting it in a recess space surrounded by concrete or metal might help to contain the signal. On the converse to that, it could also destroy the signal. So you need to know where you're putting it and put it according to what you want as an outcome. Be very cautious with just placing them above ceiling tiles. I've run into this quite often. People don't want to see the APs, or they have low ceilings, so they don't want to risk anybody bumping their head on it or something. And so they tuck them up above the ceiling tile. Make sure they're actually mounted up there and pointed in the right direction. I often find them mounted or just laying upside down, and then on top of that, they're placed underneath an HVAC vent, which is just causing nasty reflection. So mount properly, avoid above the ceiling, and also avoid placing it right next to metal. Place it a couple of feet away from it to get some of that bounce out of the situation. Some other settings that matter: band steering. Band steering is not really a standard. It causes a client device to favor one band over another. It is not natural to the devices, and thus some of your older clients may not handle it very well. Another setting which some devices, some AP support is called minimum RSSI. This is not roaming, although a lot of people think it helps with roaming. When the device reaches that set threshold, it actually gets punted off the network and is left scrambling to find a new SSID. As you can imagine, this can lead to a dropped call, lost packets, all sorts of issues. So you want to manage the power properly in order to get roaming to work. Also, make sure you understand the difference between the types of antennas. We have directional and we have omni. Not all omnis are perfect omnis. You can see some examples here on the right. They're not perfectly round. What you're seeing is on the bottom of the diagram, you're seeing the bottom or the back side of the AP, and on the upper part, you're seeing what would be the business side of the AP. So they actually print these typically upside down. So if you flip this over, it's what you would see if you mounted it on the ceiling. Directional antennas come in many different forms, and you can see they cover a much narrower area. So they're a little more focused. They typically have higher gain. Higher gain gives you more distance, more ability to reach out to those lower end devices. They're also less susceptible to noise. Some of these are integrated into the AP, and some of them are in the form of an external antenna. Big thing to keep in mind with omnis, they don't typically work well when mounted over 22 feet above the floor. 22 feet's not a hard number. I mean, I've mounted them at 20, I've mounted them at 25, but I can tell you at 30 or 40, they're probably not going to perform the way you expect. Some of the benefits to using directionals, you can narrow down the coverage cell, which allows you to pack more APs into open areas. So if we go back to that concept of an open warehouse or an auditorium or a church sanctuary, these APs up on the ceiling are going to create a very narrow cone of coverage on the ground below. Therefore, they don't see each other side to side. But an omni is broadcasting out to the side as well as down. And so all those APs up at the ceiling are going to see each other and interfere with each other. This is why we can get away with creating very specific cones of coverage in auditoriums or sanctuaries, warehouses to cover aisles and so forth. You also get the better range out of these because of the higher gain. There are some options. Your AP vendor may have some choices. They typically are limited and they tend to be a little pricey. There are a couple of other vendors out there. Celtex by Hubble is a common one we use. They have a wide variety of patterns. They have really solid mounting arms, and they're great vendor for mounts, covers, and antennas. So you can also get covers to hide APs or to protect them, different types of mounting solutions for mounting APs on a wall but face down, and other types of options. Another good brand, Ventive, they have a good selection. They are mostly in the European market. They support most manufacturers, as does the Celtex. Be careful with the Amazon vendors. There's 50 million of them out there selling antennas. Most of them have poor documentation and are not good quality. If you go into my office, you will find a box of these antennas where we've purchased numbers of them to test, and they just sit in a box collecting dust. One of these days will end up in an e-cycle bin probably. Couple of things to keep in mind. I talked about Apple earlier. Apple has some very distinct roaming rules that can make it very challenging to configure roaming correctly. When an Apple device goes to roam, it looks at the difference between the current SSID and the proposed SSID, and so it's checking the power difference. It is not going to roam if that power is not better than 12 dB difference. That's a significant amount when you're dealing in a situation like an office or a warehouse. It also then looks at the channel width, and it's going to favor wider channels over narrower. And it's also going to look at the Wi-Fi type, so Wi-Fi 7 versus 6, 5, 4, 3, etc. So it's going to score it and create a decision. Now, the roaming threshold, before it even, that has to be hit before it even thinks about roaming, for an iOS device is neg 70. For a Mac OS device, it's neg 75. The rest of the world, whether it's a Lenovo laptop or a Chromebook or whatever other device you might have, falls somewhere in between 70 and 75 typically. I've not encountered any devices that were in the 60s or beyond neg 75. I also have a link here that'll be in the slides. You can click on that link to get to their roaming document, or you can just Google Apple roaming support and you'll get the same document. So let's talk a little bit about special needs environments. We'll start off with high ceilinged environments. So we typically find these in churches, auditoriums, warehouses, manufacturing facilities. You're going to want to think about converting from omni to directional to improve the signal where it matters. You want to look at creating pods of coverage by using these directional antennas, and it'll also reduce the visibility between the APs. And this should help improve your roaming by reducing your coverage cells and thus their overlap. Keep in mind, obviously, there is a challenge servicing these. You're going to typically need high lifts. In an auditorium, that can be quite challenging if you don't have catwalks up above. Trying to get a lift into a church auditorium, for example. I've been working with a client recently. They have to rent a very special spider lift that can fit through their doors and then can be spread out over top of all the seating. In a warehouse or manufacturing plant, you're typically thinking scissor lifts or boom lifts, but some of these ceilings can get quite tall. Another type of environment would be where we have dense user accounts. This would be, for example, in a church or an auditorium again, event venues, gathering areas, conference rooms. You're going to typically want to move to higher capacity APs in these areas once it can handle more users. Be careful with that. Don't use the vendor recommended number of connections as your guide. That is literally just a connection. It means a device was able to connect and not do anything. They're not measuring what devices are doing when they put those numbers into their specifications. They are strictly saying we can have X number of connections supported. If they're trying to do anything, that number is going to go down. As a great example, one of the vendors out there advertises 300 plus users on a particular AP. We have found through actual field testing that once they're using the AP, so actually trying to download or upload, that number drops to about 30. So that's a big difference between what they advertise and what is actually supported. So this is where having knowledge or working with a consultant with the knowledge of these devices can really help. You can also combine these with high gain antennas, the directionals, to create focus areas. For example, in a lot of gymnasiums in schools that are using their gyms for testing sites, we're creating pockets of coverage that a particular AP covers, say 10, 15, 20 students, and then there's another one and another and another. So it's creating pockets of coverage so that their testing devices work the best. We also have different types of construction challenges, such as storm-proof construction with steel, concrete, and heavy doors. Run into a lot of that in some of our clients in the Florida area that we work with. Obviously, there are other areas that are starting to beef up their designs now. We also have older construction, and when you think of older construction, churches, some older schools, older homes, you run into things like heavy timber, multiple layers of construction as they add on, thicker floors, stucco, stone, and brick. Then we also have to think about renovations. You've got layers of walls, and we find this oftentimes in hospitals where they scab a building on top of the building. And so you end up with a double wall, or you end up with metal lath and plaster for renovation work, and that stuff is virtually impenetrable. Oftentimes you're going to need more access points, sometimes one per room. You're going to need to keep the power low to avoid excessive attenuation outside of the room or even within the room. You'll want to provide adequate coverage to affect proper transition. So you have to think, in a school situation, for example, with students in the room with one AP per room, they walk out into the hallway. Where's the coverage coming from as they transition to the next room? So not only do you want to cover the room, but you need to make sure the hallway has transitional coverage. You also want to make sure you know the enemy, and this is talking to the people who know the construction. So talk to your facilities people, talk to the people who did the work, the construction, find out what's going on in that facility. In densely populated areas such as apartments, high rises, business parks, urban areas, and suburban areas, keep in mind that many of the users around you might not have a single clue about proper Wi-Fi. So for example, if you're in a business park and you back up to a residential neighborhood on the other side of the fence, you're going to be dealing with the issues coming from that residential environment or the apartment that's next to you, or if you're in a high rise downtown Baltimore, for example. We were doing some work in one recently where we saw roughly 1,500 other wireless access points in the vicinity, and the vast majority of them were residential from the apartments surrounding the area. You're going to have a lot of competing wireless systems. It's going to be a high amount of channel reuse and a lot of improper use. So you're going to see a lot of 160 meg channels in use in those areas. The way you overcome these is you're going to need more APs on higher power, but you need to balance the power to avoid killing roaming. So it's a real challenge to get these environments set up correctly. Consider moving to 6 gigahertz if your devices support it. That'll give you more spectrum to work from. I would pretty much forget trying to use 2.4 for anything other than IoT usage. Areas with foliage, like a campus setting or a park or outdoor venues, you're going to want to make sure that you're using 2.4 in those cases for the best penetration. Maybe 5 gig will work. Pretty much forget 6 gig. Directional high gain antennas are going to help out here. You probably will also need a lot of APs. And keep in mind that the foliage changes with the weather. Wet makes it worse. Wind gives movement, which makes it worse. And you've got to factor in the growth. Things change as it gets older. I also consider schools a special environment because we have a concentration of users in a small space. You've got to deal with lockers, concrete, heavy doors. That's becoming more and more common now with active shooter situations, trying to create more armored doors or heavier buildings. A lot of the newer schools that I'm seeing built are concrete hallway walls with drywall in between the rooms. You've got large gathering areas here. Typically, you're going to have to go with 1 AP per classroom. You're going to need to maintain that hall coverage as well. So get coverage, but don't design for hall-fi. What we call hall-fi is where you put all the APs in the hallway, hoping they're going to reach into the classrooms. If you've got concrete walls, it's not going to work. If you've got lockers in the hallway, it's probably not going to work well. Also, make sure you know what the construction is everywhere in the building so that you make it work to the best. So how can you troubleshoot what you already have? So let's take a quick glance through some of these. We've got a lot of low cost or free tools out there. There's Wi-Fi Explorer or Insider. These are simple signal test programs. You got an option like NetSpot, which can take it up a notch and do some basic heat mapping, can check more than just the signal strength, which is important. You've also got things like Ookla or fast.com for simple speed tests, although I wouldn't rely on those very much because that's actually going outside of your network and thus introducing all the issues that you might have on the internet. A better speed test tool would be iPerf and have a local device that you're testing against so that you're trying to see what your speed is on your network. Ping or traceroute is often a simple way to check for latency or the path. Some of your medium cost tools, and medium cost could mean a couple $100 to a couple $1,000. Osseum's Channelizer and a Wi-Spy device, you can get this for about $2,000 total. It'll run on a laptop and it does basic spectrum analysis. So it can help you find those devices or issues of interference. There's also a product called the WLAN Pi Go, which was put out by the WLAN professionals and a group of people that are developing these devices for free, basically. Now you got to pay for the device, but they're not getting paid to do the development. They're just getting paid for the products they put out. It's a device that slaps on the back of an iPhone and it can do wireless packet capture, among other things. It's a good device that I keep in my toolbox. Now, there are some tools out there that might require a small mortgage, such as acrylic or tamograph. They're on the low end. They typically run about $2,000 to $4,000. The NetAlley air check device, they're running about $4,000 to $5,000. Very limited. And then there are the gold standards, which I typically say hand over your wallet. These are going to be typically in the realm of 5,000 to 10,000 or more. So there's Hamina and Ekahau, both have their own devices that can attach to them. IB Wave is probably one of the biggest ones out there as far as price, and they typically run between 15 and 20 grand. But that is also for high-end design like stadiums and things along those lines. So there are some differences between free and paid tools. Typically, your free to low cost are going to be very limited. They're not going to map the data. You're going to have to write down the notes. They're only going to check the signal strength. Sometimes they're vendor specific and only work with a specific vendor product. And then they rely on the client device for their testing, which may not be the same device that you are dealing with for your actual users. So for example, I have a higher end laptop than most of my users would have, or a better phone than some of them would have. So it's important to make sure you're testing with the right device. Your medium cost tools are going to have a narrow focus. They're going to be very specialized, like spectrum only. They might have some limited mapping, but it's not going to be extensive. And then with your high cost tools, you gain a lot of capability, plus mapping, predictive design capability, and real accuracy. So there is strategic planning that you can do to get ready for the future and that new system. We've got some uncertain economic times. We've been through them recently with COVID and all the supply chain fun, and we're dealing with them now with tariffs and other issues. So building a new network can be very expensive because there's a lot more to it than just your APs. So a good approach is to plan now, sort out what you need, and then plan on how to implement it over time if you need to reach a couple of budget cycles for this. Also, a good plan is going to provide you some tactical options that you can jump on now so that you can get some benefit, but not spending a fortune to get there. So for example, having a proper Wi-Fi design, avoid that one-to-one replacement. Make sure you're conducting a proper design survey. And then, there are some options. We've talked about these in other slide presentations we've done. There's AP on a stick, which is the most accurate, but also the most expensive. There's the kind of in-between, which is some construction testing with a predictive. We can get those fairly accurate. And then a straight up predictive, which could be accurate, it may not be. It really depends on the data you're feeding it. But these need to be done by a wireless professional that actually understands how to use the tools and understands how wireless works in your environment. These do go well beyond just signal strength checks as well. Keep in mind with Wi-Fi 7, you're going to need more than just you're going to need more than just new APs. These are going to require higher power levels, which means you might have to upgrade your switches. If you upgrade your switches, you might also need to upgrade your HVAC and your UPS needs. And then you might also be looking at upgrading your cabling to handle the higher throughputs. Now, pay attention to the PoE needs. There are various types of PoE in use, but most of these newer Wi-Fi 7 APs are going to require PoE plus, not just PoE. So it's going to require more wattage, more power, more heat, the whole 9 yards. Also, your cabling. Many of the newer APs have a 2.5, a 5, or a 10 gig port on them. You're liable to have to upgrade your switches as well as your cabling to support this. Now, Cat5e is rated to 1 gig. If wired perfectly, it might get 2.5, but it will not certify to that level. Cat6 is good for up to 155 feet, or Cat6a at 328 feet for 10 gig. And you might want to consider fiber runs between your switches, regardless of the distance, so that you get better performance and better quality. For inter-rack links, move to DAC cables. Some ideas for some tactical fixes to get by right now. A good wireless design survey to start will identify where your weaknesses are. Looking through that report with a good designer can help identify changes that could benefit you today, such as making channel and power changes to the existing environment to help improve roaming and lower the noise, maybe upgrade some of your APs, like the one in the conference room or the one in the auditorium. Maybe switch to some directional units here and there where it makes sense. And then there's also a variety of other config changes independent, or that are limited to what your system is, that they could look at. And so to wrap this up, keep in mind that your new designs should be based on Wi-Fi 7. Don't set it and forget it. Make sure you're checking your Wi-Fi environment from time to time, whether it's part of a monthly check or a quarterly check, or just even having somebody come in once a year to walk it, or every other year, or when you're starting to hear complaints. But be careful, when you start to hear complaints, there's going to be a lot more complaints coming, and you're already at a point where you might need to make some changes quickly. A good survey conducted by a professional will help identify some of those things, maybe find you some options to fix the current system. Don't forget about your UPSs, switches, and your HVAC and cabling when looking at a new system. Consider those directional antennas to improve performance. And remember, there's low-cost tools that can help you find some issues, but typically the high-end tools are going to be needed for that thorough check. And so with that, I'm going to turn things back over to Chris and wait for your questions.
Thank you, Alex. So just a couple of suggested next steps, which kind of align with what Alex has been talking about. One is you may just want to do some troubleshooting of your current Wi-Fi network. Obviously, he's gone through a lot of different things that one could try. If you're comfortable with that, then that's great. But if you want some help with that, we can certainly help you from a troubleshooting standpoint. You may be ready to think about a design engagement because you're looking for making a larger change. We can certainly help you with that. Which also then goes down to number 3, which is we can also help break that out into steps so that it kind of aligns with what your acquisition schedule and plan would need to look like at that point. And you'll also notice those on the evaluation. So if you want some more information about those, you can just note that just by checking the options on the evaluation. So with that, we don't have any questions at this point. So I'm going to thank each of you for your time today. Hope you enjoyed the pizza if you got one. And stay safe and warm out there. Thanks so much for Alex for your time, and just a reminder on the evaluations, we'll pull those one of the completed ones with a $50 Amazon gift card. Hope that helped. Hope that's you. Thanks so much, everyone. Have a great afternoon.